Hello, I'm Landon Aguilar, and this is my final presentation for Research Methods 425. Drug and alcohol abuse in America has been a problem for some time, especially among youth offenders in rural areas. Though some may believe that the drug and alcohol abuse among youth is only an urban problem, these are not the only youth abusing these substances. In fact, the rural counterparts are matching or exceeding the use of the urban delinquent youth at an alarming rate, according to Pruitt 2009. This rural youth drug problem is important to criminal justice because rural America makes up about 20% of the population of the United States. Some challenges that contribute to the drug problem among youth in rural areas are poverty, spatial isolation, inexperienced law enforcement, and less treatment options, according to Pruitt 2009. Research on rural adolescent drug use can help to have policies implemented and funding provided to rural areas with no realistic options for drug and alcohol treatment. The literature review will address findings from other research concerning characteristics from rural youth using drugs and alcohol compared to their urban counterparts, if drug and alcohol programs are more difficult to implement in rural areas, what can be learned from urban drug and alcohol prevention initiatives and applied to rural areas, and what programs are most effective in helping reduce drug and alcohol use among rural adolescent users. The methodology section will attempt to determine if there is a causal relationship between distance of a rural town from a viable drug treatment option and the recidivism rates for drug abusing adolescents at different distances. And here's the literature review. As I mentioned earlier, according to Pruitt 2009, rural America makes up about 1/5 of the total population of the United States, which means that a significant number of youth that may not have the viable treatment and prevention options that their urban counterparts may have. The idea that the drug problem among our youth in the United States is only an urban problem is simply not true. Rural youth are abusing alcohol, tobacco, and hard drugs such as methamphetamine and cocaine at higher rates than their urban counterparts. A closer examination reveals that rural youth are actually using virtually all illicit substances more than their urban counterparts, according to Pruitt 2009. From this perspective, it is easy to see that the drug problem among youth in America is definitely not restricted to urban areas, which means that these rural areas are in dire need of effective treatments that are available for urban at-risk youth. Rural areas having less experience and underfunded law enforcement agencies have contributed to the criminal drug activity, which has created an ease of access for these rural youth to acquire these substances. Poverty, low educational ambition, and availability of jobs that do not require an education are also contributing to the likelihood of substance abuse among rural youth, according to Pruitt 2009. Once this culture of poverty is developed in these areas, the separate conflicting values seem to reinforce negative behavior among substance abusing juveniles, which prevents these youth from taking advantage of the few opportunities that are available in these rural communities, according to Siegel and Walsh, 2011. Once youth acquire these antisocial values, it is likely that their rural community will punish them through some sort of informal social control. Informal social controls in these areas include things like the willingness of neighbors to watch each other's property and report suspicious activity, according to Deller and Deller 2010. Deller and Deller 2010 also mentioned that these rural areas are also very close-knit and include, which increases the likelihood of a person knowing the delinquent youth's past crimes, which could hurt these youth's chances of getting a job, making a sports team, or any other desired goal in that community. With the small populations and limited opportunities to associate with different peer groups in these rural communities, a lack of anonymity occurs. A lack of anonymity, paired with the informal social control of many rural communities, can create negative effects for using drug and alcohol among rural youth for many years into the future, making them into sorts of community outcasts, according to Pruitt 2009. Findings from a study by Botfin, Epstein, Griffin, Malgody, and Shearer, 1998, suggest that peer and parental influences contribute directly to rural youth's vulnerability to abuse illicit substances. Peers were found to be more likely to influence social decision-making, such as dating behavior and substance abuse. In addition, parents were likely to influence educational and vocational decisions of their children, according to Botfin et al. 1998. These findings imply that the most effective prevention strategies to reduce or even reverse social risk of rural youth abusing substances should target the intrapersonal and interpersonal factors associated with adolescent substance abuse, according to Botfin et al. 1998. Intrapersonal factors look at risks for substance abuse from the individual level of the juvenile, while interpersonal factors look at risks for youth to use substances from a social context, according to Ferguson and Meehan, 2011. Intrapersonal factors associated with the increasing likelihood of youth substance abuse include sensation seeking and impulse control, behavioral problems, risk-taking behaviors, hyperactivity, poor engagement in school, and academic failure, according to Ferguson and Meehan, 2011. Rural youth not being able to think about their decisions and possible repercussions in the same way an adult would, along with poor academic performance, can point youth down the path towards substance abuse. Interpersonal factors associated with youth substance abuse include negative peer relationships, favorable norms towards substance abuse, availability of illicit substances, and poor socioeconomic conditions, according to Ferguson and Meehan, 2011. Prevention strategies that attack the interpersonal factors linked with youth substance abuse are likely to be more effective than programs that do not. Rural areas can be very spatially isolated and have tiny populations, which can make some treatment options very unrealistic. Rural youth can be too far to get treatment in another place and live in a town that is too small to make it to make sense financially to build a treatment facility. These small rural communities also lack the tax base needed to fund some of these treatment and prevention programs, meaning that they will need to borrow money from the federal or state government. Most rural areas are being required to implement some simple low-cost strategies like drug and alcohol prevention in the school. Though schools are required to educate their kids on the dangers of substance abuse, many are not implementing these programs early enough or do not have the resources to implement successful drug prevention programs, according to Peru 2009. An example of a prevention program is the REAL strategy, which steps includes refuse, explain, avoid, and leave, according to Pettigrew et al. 2011. Pettigrew et al. 2011 also provides that schools should keep in mind that the REAL strategy is not a one-size-fits-all approach for rural and urban areas, but it is close. And schools need to adjust the curriculum for these prevention strategies according to the different ways rural and urban youth employ these strategies successfully. Scaramella and Keyes, as cited in Pettigrew et al. 2011, stated that only three prevention programs even considered rural populations in addition to urban populations, and none of those programs were evidence-based programs. With a lack of programs that consider the rural populations, it is obvious that programs need to be created and adapted to cover this portion of the population in order for these school-based prevention programs to be successful. Another significant reason that youth in rural areas report that they use drugs and alcohol is because of boredom. One way to combat this way of thinking is by developing after-school programs, according to Peru 2009. After-school programs are aimed at restructuring the environment for youth at risk for abusing substances and replacing that environment with positive things and people to associate with during these critical after-school hours, according to Botvin, Griffin, Murphy, 2010. Effective after-school programs need to establish a youth center where youth can participate in constructive activities like hobbies, games, sports, and community service, according to Botvin et al. 2010. Difficulties arise for these after-school programs in these rural areas due to issues such as lack of transportation for these youth, as well as lack of funding for the programs, according to Peru 2009. With more funding and a realistic system of public transportation for youth in rural areas, after-school programs can benefit at-risk youth by keeping them busy and having some adult supervision during a time when they are most likely to be doing delinquent activities such as abusing drugs or alcohol. Though prevention strategies can be helpful and successful in curbing youth and drug and alcohol abuse, for some rural youth this is not enough. For youth that continually abuse drugs and alcohol, a more intense approach is needed, which is called treatment. Treatment in rural areas can be difficult to implement because of the spatial isolation that many rural areas encounter, which prevents or limits access to treatment facilities, hospitals, and other care providers, according to Peru 2009. Peru 2009 also stated that a lack of access to viable treatment options in rural areas contributes to rural youth entering treatment later in their addictions, which makes their addictions more serious and costs much more to treat these drug offenders. Only 1.2% of American substance abuse treatment facilities were located in rural areas. Of these treatment facilities, very few offered the extensive types of treatments offered in urban areas. Another significant issue that becomes a major difficulty for rural youth substance abuse is the fact that rates of drug and alcohol use and rates of risk-taking behaviors such as driving under the influence or binge drinking for youth increase the more rural a community is, according to Lampert, Gale, and Hartley, 2008. Lampert et al. Explains that the most rural areas face the greatest obstacles in terms of law enforcement, prevention, and treatment perspectives because of the challenges they face with low population density, limited resources for large geographic areas, and prevailing problems with unemployment and poverty. With the smaller infrastructure of these rural areas and the likelihood of being farther from a viable treatment option, the most extreme rural youth substance abuse becomes even less likely to receive treatment options that could help them conquer these terrible addictions. There are strategies such as prevention and treatment methods that have been proven successful in helping youth conquer their battle with illicit substances, but very few of which are aimed to help towards helping rural communities, according to Scaramella and Keys, 2011. Programs and strategies need to be developed to help these rural youth specifically. And here's my methodology. In our research regarding the distance of a rural town from a viable drug treatment option and the recidivism rates for drug-abusing adolescents at different distances, we would use a causal hypothesis, which predicts that youth who are farther from a viable drug treatment option will recidivate more with drug and alcohol offenses than youth who are closer to said treatment options. The goal of this research is to find out if recidivism rates in more rural towns are higher than less rural towns. Less rural meaning having a realistic drug treatment option, with the intentions of getting these disadvantaged youth realistic treatment options if the numbers are in fact higher. This goal is important to the criminal justice system because rural America makes up a significant part of our population, which means we are not giving some of these youth with drug and alcohol problems in the most rural areas a serious chance at conquering their addictions to these substances. In our research, we would use an interrupted time series design which measures the dependent variable periodically across many time points, and the treatment occurs only if the offenders are close enough to realistically be treated in their rural towns. The independent variable of the study will be distances towns are from a viable treatment option. The dependent variable of the study will be rates of recidivism for youth who are arrested or cited for drug and alcohol offenses. The population would consist of all rural towns in Idaho which have populations of less than 2,500 people at varying distances from youth drug treatment options. This research is going to measure the differences between youth drug recidivism rates between rural towns that are 25 miles or less, 26 to 50 miles, 51 to 75 miles, 76 to 100 miles, and 101 miles or more away from a drug treatment program and see if there's a noticeable difference. This research will be using a consensus because the population will include all rural towns in Idaho with populations of 2,500 people or less. Idaho is a very rural state, and 172 of the 227 cities are rural towns with populations of less than 2,500. The data will be collected by measuring how far a town is from the closest available youth drug treatment option. Once the distances are measured, we can then group the towns into categories mentioned earlier. After we have grouped these towns by distance, we can then include the towns, all youth in those towns with drug or alcohol offenses, and measure the recidivism rates for youth drug and alcohol offenses every 4 months. Data will be taken every 4 months for a 5-year period from 2008 in January to January 2013. This data was collected from the police department's arrest records in these rural areas. The type of study that I'm doing is an interrupted time series design because it allows me to access data from pre-existing treatments and then examine the data from these rural areas and see if there are differences in the recidivism rates according to the distances from these treatments. Some possible threats to internal validity of this sample could be compensatory behavior on behalf of the police departments which I gathered the data, because many of them could think that high youth drug recidivism rates in these areas would portray their departments as negative, which it wouldn't be, and I don't think that will be a serious problem in my study. And once data is collected for each rural town and grouped into their respective categories, we can then analyze the data to see if there are higher recidivism rates among youth in rural areas over 101 miles from treatment compared to the closest 25 miles or less category. That was my presentation, and hope you enjoyed it, and I can't wait to watch the rest of yours. Thank you.